Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about the black horsemen of the apocalypse. Previously we've talked about the green horse or the pale horse, and we learned that that horse is Islam. That these horses as represented in the Bible are forces, four forces that are going to be present at the end times that are going to lead to Armageddon. So we started with the green horse, and now we're going to look at the black horse. I'm just going to read you the section from the Bible, which is in Revelation 6. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." So what we're going to try to do is to explain what this is, what this force is, what it could be today, since we consider that we're probably living in the end times. Okay, in saying that a person would get a quart of wheat for a day's wages and 3 quarts of barley, is basically saying that a daily wage will barely feed a person with nothing left over. That is what's going to be measured out by the black horsemen, or a certain portion of the population. It doesn't say which portion, but it basically says that they will be living in abject poverty and not be able to afford anything. It just basically food for themselves. And then it also says that there's a voice that says, "Do not damage the oil and the wine." What this is saying is that people who are rich, who hold the commodities, oil and wine, which were signs of wealth back in the time that this was written, those who hold those riches will not be harmed. Okay, now I want to try to discern what this force is that we're looking for, and this is going to be a rather lengthy discussion, so I hope that you're able to watch it and bear with it. First of all, I've heard one commentator say that the black horse represents capitalism, and I want to dispute that. It can't possibly represent capitalism. Let's define capitalism. It's an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decisions and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods, that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. Okay, now the first thing that I want to say about the black rider is he's evil. All these riders are evil. They're not good. So in order to say that the black rider is evil, you would have to say that capitalism is an evil system. Capitalism can't possibly be an evil system because there's no command against in the Bible doing anything that capital goods is. There's no command not to have private or corporate ownership of capital goods in the Bible. There's no command not to make investments made by private decision. There's no command against free markets. And so capitalism is not an evil system when you put it against the standard of what the Bible says. So capitalism cannot be the black rider. Now, along with this, I want to just give a definition of socialism, because socialism is an evil system. Socialism is defined as any various economic systems and political theories that advocate collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. A system of society or group living which there is no private property. A system or condition of society which means production is owned and controlled by the state. That's a basic definition. Of course, there's levels of socialism. There's systems that are partially socialistic, mostly socialistic, like Europe, and then there's communism, which is the total extreme end of socialism. Now, socialism is an evil system, and this is why. because there's two commandments in the Bible. One says you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. That's one of the commandments. And the other one is you shall not steal. Now, in order for socialism, or there to be socialism, you have to have the redistribution of wealth. And the only way to redistribute wealth is to take it from one person or to steal it from one person and transfer it to another person. And that's what socialism does. So at its very heart, when compared against what the Bible says, socialism is an evil system and shouldn't be followed. Now, another system that I want to talk about here that's going to help us decide who the Black Rider is the central banking cabal. Now, when I talk about the central banking cabal, I'm talking about the central bankers in every country throughout the world, that all of them kind of lumps them all in together because they all work together in a world system. At the head of this central banking cabal is, of course, the Federal Reserve System of the United States, which is the head of it because the dollar is the currency standard, is the reserve currency throughout the world. So that puts our central bank, known as the Federal Reserve, at the top of this list and is the major player. Now, where did the central bank come from in the United States, or the Federal Reserve? It was created by an act of Congress in 1913, and at that time it gained total control over the U.S. money supply. The Federal Reserve is not a part of the federal government. The only connection it has is that it's appointed, the president appoints the chairman. But other than that, it has nothing to do is not connected to the federal government. It doesn't open its books to Congress. It can be called before Congress to testify, but it does not have to provide details on everything it does to Congress, or does it need to get permission for what it does from Congress. Now, because the USA is no longer in control of its money supply, and it hasn't been since 1913, we're doomed to high inflation, uncontrolled spending, and eventually economic collapse. And I'm going to explain that. One thing that I would like you to listen to if you have a chance, if you have any doubts about the U.S. government being in control of its money supply, in August of 2009, Congressman Alan Grayson questioned Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke on a $550 billion loans that were made to foreigners. They were called central liquidity swaps. So that's all they are, is loans to foreign banks. And basically in this conversation, Ben Bernanke tells Alan Grayson that from the Federal Reserve Act, he has power to do everything he does and total control over the money supply without getting permission from Congress. It's an amazing little piece, and if you'd like to go on YouTube and see it, just type in Alan Grayson questioning Ben Bernanke, Federal Reserve Chairman, and it'll come up. From that film, you can see that Ben Bernanke has total control over our money supply and not the United States government. Now, in the United States, the currency was linked with gold up until 1933. In other words, you could exchange gold for currency, a currency for gold. That was until 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt fixed the price of the U.S. dollar. I think it was $35 to an ounce of gold, and forced all U.S. citizens to turn in their gold. So there was no one in the U.S. legally holding gold, and the only people that could get dollars for gold were foreigners. That was in 1933. In 1975, the gold standard was totally eliminated in the United States, so our currency became totally fiat. In other words, it had no intrinsic value. That's what Fiat currency means it's not backed by anything, it's just a piece of paper. As of today, all world currencies are fiat. There aren't any that are backed by anything. None of them have any intrinsic value. Now, why did the U.S. government give away our sovereignty, which basically when you allow somebody to control your currency, you're giving away your sovereignty. Why did the U.S. government give away our sovereignty to bankers? Well, there definitely was a reason for doing this. Most of them were fairly stupid reasons, but they did it anyways, and some of them were self-serving reasons. The main self-serving reason is that for giving away the sovereignty of the control of the currency to a Federal Reserve Bank is it allows the U.S. government to spend unlimited amounts of money, since the central bank can print it and give it to the government at no cost, or little cost because it can control the interest rates. So the Federal Reserve can print any amount of money, give it to the federal government, and charge a minimal amount of interest, so that the government it doesn't cost them a high amount of money in interest for the money that they borrow. It allows the bank to flood markets with currency during depressions. And I just want to define here, a depression is anything that is what we call a recession now is actually a depression. They were always called depressions in the past, but they changed the terminology. So recessions and depressions and the Great Depression are all basically depressions in an economy. Allowing the bank to flood the markets with currency during a depression stimulates the economy. It causes the economy to recover. Unfortunately, this is a bad thing, because there's a reason why the economy went into a depression to begin with. And when you dump all this money into a depressed economy, it prevents the markets from recovering normally. It creates, worse bubbles, which eventually collapse and impoverish the nation farther than they would have been impoverished initially. It's politically good, since the government can say, like it does today, that it created jobs and got us out of a recession. But it's harmful to the economy, and that's what we have to understand. The creation of the Federal Reserve allows the Federal Reserve to create currency by increasing supply and artificially decreasing interest rates, which it does. Now, just to define inflation, inflation means goods, the prices for goods are inflated, but currency becomes worth less money. So currency is actually deflated in what they call inflation. All right. The Federal Reserve causes inflation in the U.S.A., which devalues the money. But why do we see it only in some goods? Like, for instance, today we know there's inflation around, but in some areas there isn't any inflation. The goods are either the same or just maybe a little bit more expensive. And I'm going to explain that a little later in how the U.S.A. and China and other countries manipulate currency. That explains why in our imported goods we don't see inflation. But we do see inflation in other areas, in goods that are produced here, and in food, and in energy and commodities. There we see high inflation. But in other areas we don't see any inflation. The Federal Reserve causes inflation overseas as other fiat currencies try to devalue to keep their goods cheaper. When the Federal Reserve creates inflation here, countries that overseas that want to sell us goods have to also create inflation in their economies to keep their goods, the value of their goods, cheaper than our goods. Those here on fixed income become poorer because of inflation as interest rates are artificially kept low and the rate of inflation increases. This is theft from the poor. It's stealing from the poor and those who have savings, because anyone who lives on a fixed income can't make it a decent interest rate on the money that they have, and the money that they have is constantly being devalued. Those who are able to borrow become richer as they borrow at rates lower than inflation. For instance, if you borrow money, you can buy it at really cheap rates now because the Federal Reserve is dumping money into the economy. And the only reason they can do that and that you can borrow at cheap rates is because they're stealing that money from the poor. The poor are experiencing a loss of income, while others who are able to borrow become richer as they borrow at extremely low rates that are lower than the rate the money is inflating. Now, I just want to explain to you the central bank currency game. And this explains why the United States is becoming poorer and more impoverished, or at least a large section of our population is becoming poorer and more impoverished with the high unemployment. Okay, let's look at what happens with China. Both the dollar and the yuan, which is the Chinese currency, are fiat and can be artificially set by their respective governments to any value. And they can do this because they're in control of it, of whatever the value is. Now, this is what happens. China's central bank sets an artificially low value of the yuan with respect to the dollar. Now, I'm just going to use an example. Say if the real value of a yuan is equal to $1, what the Chinese government does is they say, no, we don't want that. We want the value of the yuan to be less. So they have reasons for this. So what they say is, we'll give you 2 yuans for every dollar. So, and then they fix that price there, and they do everything they can to keep that there. China does this for a good reason. They want to make their goods cheaper for us to buy, since if they're cheaper for us to buy, we'll buy more of them. Since their businesses are government owned, the government becomes richer as we buy more and more of their goods because they are cheap. So in a communist system, the government owns all the factories and everything, so they're the ones that become rich. They have cheap labor, they own the factory, so all that money coming in from the U.S. goes right to the government. The flip side of this is that imported goods to the Chinese people are more expensive. In other words, our goods are twice as expensive to them, to their citizens. So they can't afford to buy imported goods like what we're buying. Everything is imported. Chinese can't afford to buy our goods because they're so expensive. Also, as the U.S. inflates its money, in other words, as we print more of our money, China must also keep printing their money to inflate their currency at the same rate. Otherwise, their goods would not remain cheaper for us. So they must inflate their money as we inflate ours. This causes chronic high inflation in China, which increases the poverty of the people because their jobs are low paying and all the money that's coming in goes to the government. But the Chinese government doesn't care about the people in China. They don't care if the yuan is inflated because they have dollars. They have the dollars that are coming in. It allows the Chinese government to keep their people enslaved in low-paying jobs that they can't advance in. China is only an example here that I'm using. The same thing happens in many other countries throughout the world. So this system that we're seeing now is a system that creates poverty and keeps people in poverty in socialistic governments. It keeps them enslaved, basically. If you look at the Chinese workers, you'll see that most of them live a very slave-like existence. They live at the factories where they work. They never get out of them. They work long hours. And then those cheap goods are sold to the United States, but they don't benefit from it or minimally benefit from us. You're starting to see, if you're looking back at the Black Horseman and how he makes certain people richer and other people poorer, you're starting to see that here. Now, why does the U.S. allow this? Why does the U.S. allow Chinese government to manipulate the currency, their currency, to make it worth less than ours? The main reason they allow this is because it disguises inflation created by our central bank and keeps it artificially low on imported goods. So anything that we import is artificially cheaper than it would be otherwise if we manufactured it. Anything we manufacture will be more expensive. That's why you can go into like a hardware store and not find any American goods manufactured in that store that they're selling. American manufactured goods in the store. They don't exist anymore because the only goods that people will buy are the cheaper ones. Why would they spend more money? You know, say for instance, if you could go into a store and you can have want to buy a hammer, and the American hammer costs you $20, but you can buy an imported one for $5. Which one are most people going to buy? They're going to buy the $5 hammer. They're not going to buy the $20 one. So you can see how this policy drives American companies out of business. Goods manufactured here still inflate. The American hammer still inflates, but the Chinese one doesn't because it's underpriced. The U.S.A. excludes some manufactured goods here from the inflation index, like food and energy, so that because these goods that are created here would reflect inflation, they're not in the inflation index, so it's not reflected in that. The U.S. citizen likes all this because the items it can buy are much cheaper Chinese items that they can afford. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to afford really even to buy a hammer. Who would buy a $20 hammer when they can buy one for $5? The negative side of this for the U.S.A. is that it has destroyed manufacturing in this country. It's the reason our unemployment rate is so high, especially with unskilled laborers, and that they can no longer get jobs. It's the reason why you walk down the streets, for instance, and actually in any city, but like you really see it in Detroit. It's the reason why there's so many abandoned factories throughout our country. Now, just to summarize, what I want to say here is the central banks are created to allow unlimited government spending. They impoverish the people through inflation and unemployment and currency manipulation. They create a rich elite of bankers and cronies and others who become wealthy, giving out and getting cheap printed money and goods, all at the expense of the poor and those who have saved money. Now look again at the description of the Black Rider, and you'll see that perfectly describes what the Black Rider is doing. Now, what would be a solution to all of this? There is only one solution. The only solution to this is to get rid of fiat currencies, to go back to the gold standard, to get the government to stop manipulating the prices of gold and how many dollars there are with gold, and let the price of gold free float, and then not trade with any country that also isn't on the gold standard unless you add the gold standard value to the price that they have undervalued their currency. So in order to totally get rid of this, you have to have everyone on the gold standard, or anyone that you're trading with not to be on, that isn't on the gold standard, would have to be penalized to the point where their currency would actually be worth the value of gold. At that point, then all currencies would be equal. They couldn't be manipulated by their governments. And what would happen is, in the United States, since we're such a productive country, all of the jobs and technology would come right back here again, because we could outproduce China in any measure if we were playing on a level playing field, which we're not. Now, what is going to happen, because that isn't going to happen? The currencies aren't going to become fiat. They're not going to become based on gold again. They're going to remain fiat. So what is going to happen? Well, because the government is going to continue spending ad infinitum, it won't be able to stop spending. The trillion-dollar deficits are going to be multi-trillion-dollar deficits, and eventually we won't be able to pay the interest on these deficits, no matter how low they keep the interest rates, and eventually the interest rates will be forced to go up. Eventually, what I'm saying is our government is going to collapse now, which means we'll have a currency crisis, and our currency will become so inflated it will never buy anything. That's what we're looking for. Now, at the point where our currency collapses, we have this currency crisis, we'll have two choices. One choice will be to repudiate our debt, to get rid of whatever wealth we have in paying off our debts, and to start a new currency that is totally backed by gold and silver. If we did that, that would solve the problem. We could get rid of the Federal Reserve, have our currency would be backed by gold, and our sovereignty would be back with the government. I don't think that's what's going to happen, because that's not what the Bible says is going to happen. The Bible says, or indicates, that there's going to be a world economic collapse, and that through that collapse, one person is going to get control over the world economy. That when the whole world economy collapses because the dollar collapses, what they're going to do is they're just going to create a new currency, a new fiat currency. And one world government and one person in particular will get control over that currency. And when that happens, the world will be enslaved to this world dictator. They won't have any choice, because they won't have any money unless this world dictator allows it, unless you bow down to him. So that's what the Bible says is going to happen. So we have two things. Either we can do the right thing, get rid of our fiat currency, get rid of the Federal Reserve, get our sovereignty back, and get our manufacturing back and our jobs and have prosperity again. Or we can continue down the same road where we will be enslaved to a one world leader and one world government, which I believe is what the Bible says is going to happen. Thanks for listening. I know this was a little bit long, but it takes a little bit of time to explain all this stuff. I hope you did understand most of it. You can read about these things on the internet. They're not that hard to find. And you can read about Austrian economics, which is the kind of economics I support. Will give you an idea of sustainable economics rather than the path that we're on right now. Thanks again for listening. Bye.